Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dawn Lester and David Parker, authors of a fabulous new book, What Really Makes You Ill? Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us, guys, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much, Nigel, and
good to be here.
It's good to be here. It's great to be able to talk to you, and thank you for talking to us.
Well, let's get straight to the fundamentals. How do you view this thing we call illness, and you know what motivated you to write the book?
I think let me just say that it took us, Dawn and I, 10 years of research for this book. It's quite a mammoth tome. It's nearly 800 pages and 40 pages of citations of reference work. So a long gestation period, if you like. So, and it was started by sort of things that had happened certainly in my life, with inconsistencies with family members that had been diagnosed with cancer, and, you know, they'd taken the normal prescribed methods of treatment and unfortunately all died. I'm talking at least half a dozen people here. So I thought, well, there's definitely something wrong here, because I was being told by the medical establishment, you know, they have an improving rate with treating cancer, you know, and were 50% successful. So I knew, well, that's wrong, because all the people that you've treated that are my close family and friends have all died. So you've got a 100% failure rate. So that was sort of one of the things that kicked it off. And another was that, because Don and I have known one another for over 20 years, so we've written other books together, another couple of small books, but we used to write under a pen name called NOR, which stands for Nature of Reality, because the very first book we wrote was about the nature of reality. And it's whilst we were writing that book that there was a chapter that was talking about health, but specifically about viruses. And we realised that we probably didn't really know enough about viruses, because at that time, and we're going back at least over 10 years now, we had the same view, I guess, that everyone else had, that we'd been brought up to believe that illnesses of most shapes and sizes were caused by germs of one sort or another, either bacteria or viruses, for the most part. And the vaccinations were good for you. You know, they sort of stopped you getting these diseases. You know, that's what we'd been brought up to believe. And we still believed it at that time when we were writing this book, first book. So when we decided we need to do some research to find out more about viruses. And we very soon ran into all sorts of anomalies, shall we say. The first of which was HIV/AIDS. You know, we're old enough to have grown up when that scare was all about. Now, I won't go into too much detail about it, because I know you've done recent sort of interviews with people and you've talked about that whole thing in depth. But we had to investigate it, and we soon found out that everything we'd been told about that particular disease by the authorities was completely wrong. You know, there was no virus that had been actually isolated properly and proved to actually cause the disease. And it soon became obvious to us with further investigation that there were much more probable causes. You know, it's quite obvious what there were. And many other doctors also knew this, but were not given the public voice, if you like, to say it. And without going into any more, I mean, we do detail all this in our book, of course, but without boring your audience, who've probably heard it all before, it soon became obvious to us that there was a real problem with what we were being told officially about HIV/AIDS. And we soon knew it was nothing to do with the virus, and it was all preventable and caused by quite easily detectable things.
Sure.
So Dawn and I sort of said, well, blimey, you know, if the medical establishment were so wrong about something as major as HIV/AIDS, what else are they wrong about?
Yes.
And that's it, really. That's what started a 10-year research
So you've been researching the book for about 10 years. And
Yes.
I mean, do you have medical qualifications, or is your qualification your avid determination to uncover the truth, which I think is an excellent qualification, personally?
It
The
is.
latter.
It is really, because
Yeah.
I mean, both Dawn and I have technical backgrounds, but
Mhm.
mine's in electrical engineering,
Yeah.
and Dawn's is in accountancy.
Yeah.
But our mind and qualifications are such that we're used to research. We're used to following logic and detail.
Yeah.
So it set us in a perfect condition, really, to be able to research anything.
Yeah.
And as we found out, was a great asset to be able to research this medical fallacy, shall we say, because as we found out, because we did talk to many doctors about their education, and we realised that because we were unfettered by any of their restrictions when they did their 4 years medical training, as I've often said to people, it became obvious that they're sort of educated almost by rote,
Yeah.
while they're doing their exams, they're told, well, this bacteria causes that disease, this virus causes that disease, this is the treatment. They were unable to do any research of their own, and they just had to answer their questions according to what they were taught.
Indeed.
Whereas,
I think you're almost more qualified, aren't you, if you avoid that sort of instruction.
Yes.
We've all heard, well, a lot of people have heard that doctors do very little work in nutrition. You hear various reports of between 15 minutes to an hour total in their whole study to get qualified. So absolutely. So what's your come from, if you like, you two? How would you describe it? There are various terms like functional medicine, alternative medicine, natural, or the mainstream view is obviously allopathic. So where do you fit on that spectrum? How would you describe your approach?
Okay. Well, as we learnt, and this was over the period of years that we were studying this, as to the main question, what really makes you ill, was we would put it into the bracket of natural health, because what we found is that the human body, has amazing resources for healing itself. In fact, as we've came to understand, only the body can heal itself, and you can either hinder it or you can help it to do that. But at the end, only the body can heal itself, and it has all the resources to do that. But of course, the allopathic system actually gets in the way of that. There is nothing within modern Western medicine, all the drugs I'm talking about, there is nothing that they can claim that cures anything, nothing at all. So they can ameliorate pain, if you like. They're very good at that. It's got some very powerful painkillers. They're good at fixing bones and things like that. But as regards disease, we found that not only do they not understand it, they don't understand the process, they don't understand how the body gets ill, and they certainly don't understand how to put it right. So they just give one drug or another, which very often makes the situation worse. And so hence people have lots of side effects, and they end up taking more drugs after the other, and can soon end up in a lifetime of taking drugs, none of which heal them.
We discovered really that the answer to the problem of so-called illness or disease, whatever, we can go into that in more detail, is not to actually try and cure it, treat it, is to actually remove the cause. Yeah. And so we discovered that, through years of looking into various different diseases, especially the ones that are labelled so-called infectious diseases, that there are none of these conditions are actually the result of germs. So right. Then that was a huge eye-opener for us.
Yeah. We'll look more into germ theory, yes. but so your approach is natural medicine as opposed to the sort of approach of your conventional doctor, which is just to treat symptoms with drugs. And yes. As you just said there, David, it's funny because all of these drugs that you get from the doctor, they have a massive long list of effects, yes. Don't they? And they just sort of pick one out and magnify that, and all the others are sort of put to the bottom as side effects. And yeah. It seems such a sort of a non-fundamental way of approaching anything. I mean, I think most rational people, when they hear that that's the doctor's approach, it's like, well, what about what causes this? What about why am I ill?
That's exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the thing. But again, people say, oh, they're side effects. But in fact, they are direct effects, because if people hadn't taken that particular medication or vaccine, that effect wouldn't have happened.
Right.
They're only called side effects because they're not the desired effect.
No, exactly.
But I mean, as you say, I mean, some of the side effects are admitted to be worse than the sort of original disease.
Yes.
The only reason I was mentioning germs, and obviously we'll come back to it, is that we realised, well, if germs don't cause disease, we have to actually look at something else to see what is or what are the causes of ill health and symptoms and diseases. So we just kept digging, and that's where we came across the idea of natural health, that the body is naturally healthy. Again, which is a complete inversion of what we're told, that you have to go to see the doctor if you're ill, but and the body isn't given any kind of abilities whatsoever. So it's we're just some useless bag of chemicals, which of course we're not. So when you start realizing that the germ theory is wrong, and you say, well, okay, what does cause disease? Well, there are other diseases, like chronic diseases, that aren't supposed to be caused by germs. So we looked at those and say, well, why are people getting these so-called diseases? Because they are increasing, they're not decreasing. If the medical establishment system worked, people would be healthier, and they're clearly not. So there's something wrong. So we had to keep digging to look at why the body has problems, has reactions, has symptoms. So we just kept delving into that.
And to arrive at an answer to what makes the body ill, we decided to just look at, as Dawn has said, pick at random almost, main diseases, and it could be anything from tuberculosis to measles, chickenpox. We even went back in history. We're often famous for talking about the Black Death. We looked at what was that all about, and we can talk about that if you wish.
Yes. Well, before we do that, can you? So what causes disease really is the fundamental issue, isn't it? What really makes you ill is the title of your book, and you're suggesting in the subtitle that everything we think we know is wrong, and I completely concur with that. So how would you describe the main causes of disease? Does it fall into several categories? How would you?
Well, what we did over the 10-year period of research and looking at all these different diseases, both in animals, I might add, as well as humans, because we wanted to see if the same theories that we were coming up with actually applied to all life, really, and we found it did. And what we boiled it down to in the end was 4 factors, what we call the 4 factors in our book, which we explain, and they are inadequate nutrition, toxic overload, EMFs, and prolonged emotional stress. And we found that all illness, we'll say illness rather than disease, because disease is a bit of a loaded word and people have all sorts of misconceptions about it. So we'll say illness. And we found that all illness was attributed to one or more, it's usually a combination of those 4 factors. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Can you just expand on that difference between illness and disease? Because that's an interesting one. I've heard people make that separation before. Which is which? What's a disease versus what's an illness? Can you elaborate?
Okay.
Well, I was going to say, well, what we think of as disease are various collections of symptoms, and each disease, or there's supposed to be thousands of them, apparently are identified by the various symptoms that are all written down. It's the WHO's ICD code, so everyone's got their manual of, collection of symptoms. And so if you've got these symptoms, oh, it's probably this. And sometimes there are further tests to see if they can detect some kind of abnormality within the body. But the idea is that disease is, these different diseases are specific entities that attack the body. That's something that you get, whereas we're saying the complete opposite. It's the inversion, that conditions arise within the body as a result of exposure to toxins or poor nutrition or diet. So it's the body that develops these problems or is damaged and therefore develops problems and creates symptoms. And it's the symptoms that make people feel ill. They think they've got a disease. It's not. They've got different collections of symptoms, but it's the symptoms that are misunderstood. The most symptoms, not all, but most symptoms are the body's efforts to actually repair itself, to heal itself. So things like coughing, sneezing, runny nose, those kinds of what you might call cold or flu symptoms are the body's efforts to expel toxins and it's basically a detoxification process.
I've even heard that the fever is like that, isn't it? When you actually run a temperature,
yes.
does that fall into that basket?
Yes, so the body's sort of heating up, and it's a way of possibly opening the pores, so different toxins come out different ways, but also to indicate that if you're feeling unwell, to rest, because that's one of the best things to do if you're not feeling well is to rest, not to keep fighting it, and certainly not to suppress it with any kind of medications.
Drugs.
Drug of the legal kind, but anyway, so illness is how you feel when you're having these symptoms, whereas the disease is the name given to the sort of collection of symptoms. But it's as if diseases are sort of separate entities, and as we say, they're not. There are no different diseases. There are just combinations of symptoms that represent various actions of the body to heal itself. That's mainly what are called so-called infectious diseases, although there are no infectious agents. Then you have chronic conditions which are more serious, which is usually what happens if you carry on abusing the body or being exposed to toxins or whatever, and the damage is more severe, and so the symptoms are more severe.
And the other reason we don't like to use the word disease is because, as I said earlier, because it's a loaded word, and as soon as you say disease, people think of germs, viruses in particular.
Right.
So, which is a misnomer, really.
Yeah.
And as Dawn said, there are no diseases that you catch. You can't catch a disease, and we explain why in the book, and we can talk about that. So, yes, the body can be ill for all sorts of reasons, and as I've said previously, we found that it will be one or more of those four factors that has made the body ill. And when you identify those four factors and correct them, the body will get well again. It's as simple as that.
So basically, you're saying, just if I understood you correctly, you're saying that firstly, the body could be getting insufficient nutrition, so a problem with diet, essentially, and not adequately nourished. Then it could be a toxicity issue, some kind of environmental poison or toxicity. It could be in food as well, couldn't it? It could be internal, but some sort of poison. Electromagnetic fields, you've got categorized in there as a major source, and also the stress, emotional stress or psychological reasons.
Prolonged stress,
like the fear that people are under at the moment.
Yes,
right, yes,
which is generated deliberately, which again for reasons that we can go into, but that has a very detrimental effect on people, on their whole physiology, and causes all sorts of things like free radicals to be released in the body, which happens in the body all the time, but when you get an excess of them, and if those other factors that we mentioned, particularly nutrition, the body can't get rid of those free radicals, then they start to damage down at cellular level and even down to organ level, and so you get all sorts of other illnesses, even cancers, if the body can't clean itself properly, to keep it in simple terms.
Yeah, it's interesting to note, isn't it, that the disease sort of trigger word and everybody's sort of automatic thought, virus, catching something, this very much suits this sort of big pharma sort of the tag team, if you like, between big pharmaceutical corporations and government, this sort of politicization of healthcare or disease management, we should say, because it isn't healthcare at all, is it? It's disease management.
No.
The National Health Service is the National Disease Management Service, really, in this country. Yeah. But it's very much this sort of widely held perception is not only fostered, but it very much suits these interests, doesn't it? And your model really sort of turns that over on its head. So maybe we could return to the idea of germ theory, because that really is like a foundation stone, isn't it, to the allopathic model. The need to vaccinate and all this sort of stuff is very much based on the idea that you catch a disease. So could you elaborate on how you discovered that to be false, and indeed why, if you can come up with any your reasons and the proof and your journey through that?
Well, a potted version of it, obviously, because otherwise it'll take all
big
night.
Topic.
But, it's the germ theory, and we do point out to people it's called the germ theory, i.e. theory being the operative word, i.e. it's not been proven, and it certainly hasn't been proven. But it's, as you quite rightly point out, it's a very convenient vehicle for the pharmaceutical companies. Much money is made out of it. So we look back at that, how it first came into being, and as most people know, if we go back about 150 years, the sort of main proponent of it was Pasteur. He's sort of credited with it, although in our research it did start before him, but like many things, he claimed credit for it, and there's even the Pasteur Institute in France, so he's still very much lionized by the mainstream, but quite unrightly so. But it's never been proven. It started, first of all, with optical microscopes when they knew people got ill, of course, and with their microscopes they could see in the blood things which were at that time bacteria. And what they saw was wherever there was diseased or dying tissue, there'd be a cluster of bacteria around it. And they just immediately jumped to the assumption that the bacteria were the cause of the dead and dying tissue. And that was the first and most fundamental mistake.
Because they believed that the body was sterile.
Right. And what they didn't realise is the bacteria were cleaning up in the same way as they do out in the forest, when you've got dead trees, rotting vegetation. You can check, and there's lots of bacteria because they're breaking it down to return it back to the earth, as it were. Yeah. And that's what bacteria do in the body.
Especially in the gut.
Well, yes, particularly in the gut. Without them, we wouldn't be able to be alive. They're the cleanup agents, and we often use the analogy of it to be like blaming firemen for causing house fires, just because whenever you see a house fire, there's a load of firemen around it, and so therefore you then blame them for the house fire. And that's really what happened to start with bacteria. And then sort of jumping forward a bit to the 1930s, because the medical establishment at the time knew they couldn't blame everything on bacteria, so they assumed there was something else, but they couldn't see it with optical microscopes. But then in the 1930s, the electron microscope came into being, where they could see much smaller particles. And then they could see these tinier particles in the blood, which got the misnomer of virus. The word virus, if just potted history really, the word virus comes from the Latin, and its original meaning was poison or noxious substance. Okay, nothing to do with particles in the body. So the word got hijacked really by the medical profession in later years to then be given to the name of these little tiny particles that they could now see in the blood. But we must point out that these particles have never been seen doing anything because with an electron microscope you can't see any movement. It's whatever you put under an electron microscope has to be dead, and they're only black and white photographs, so it has to be stained and prepared, and you see just a black and white flat image. Okay, so that's all they could see. And even today, they recognise, the medical establishment recognise that these particles, which they're calling viruses, are not alive and have never been alive, which begs the question how they can attribute so much damage to these particles for something that's not alive. They attribute them to invading cells and reproducing.
They're the enemy.
But how can something that's not alive do any of these things? And of course they don't.
Yes.
And they're supposed to stay, on surfaces that you can pick them up, and just by touching them, they're supposed to be able to get into your body.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no evidence for that.
Or they can travel
whatsoever.
through the air.
Yes, travel through the air,
you can
through your sneeze.
inhale them. But a dead, whatever, one of these particles which has never been alive, even if it did float through the air and you inhaled it, how can it do anything? It's not a live thing.
It has no self-propelled motion.
It has no motion. It has no reproductive facilities. And when we looked into the science of this, of course, and realised this, and we realised as well, so we started to look for the scientific papers that showed what any of these viruses did. And again, cutting a long story short, we realised that these particles, I'll call them that rather than virus, because again, it's a loaded word. Everyone thinks a virus is something that does something, and it doesn't, and it's never been proved to do anything. So these little particles have never been isolated properly, purified, categorized with its full DNA makeup, or proved to cause any disease at all. And that goes from any disease that gets attributed to them, whether it's measles or COVID-19. These particles have never been proved to do anything. And this beggars belief, doesn't it? Because they attribute an ever-growing number of diseases to being caused by these viral particles, and yet they have no scientific proof to prove any of it.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a very convenient business map for the pharmaceutical companies, who then produce lots of lotions and potions to kill these things that are not alive in the first place and have never been proved to actually do any harm. They're not pathogens at all.
If I can just interject there, David, I don't want to make you lose your thread, but it's so difficult for most people who haven't ever asked these questions before to grasp that if what you're saying is true, that viruses have never caused anything, there's a massive lie going on. Or if it isn't a lie, it's a huge assumption that sort of snowballed out of control. And you've got a whole, it's bigger than an industry, isn't it? The whole big pharma thing, what is it, 7, 8, maybe 10 billion? I don't know how much they make. It's probably way more than that. Staggering amounts of money. And it's all riding on the coattails of this assumption that these little things cause disease. And yet your average person will hear somebody say, oh, it's never been proven. And yet they'll try and reconcile that statement with the BBC News telling us to take COVID seriously. We hear that almost all the time, don't we, here in the UK? Take it seriously, this dangerous disease. And out there in the world at large, it's like when you're 6 and everyone tells you that Father Christmas is real. And of course, the people in the shops and the person at the bank or everyone, and the postman comes around and he tells you it's real. And like you're going, hang on. Well, if everybody says it's real, it must be real. And yet eventually we find out, of course, that Father Christmas isn't real. And this is on that scale, isn't it? It's
that's the first time I've heard that.
It's just staggering deception. But
if only it was, on the level of Father Christmas. But you're absolutely right. It is actually making people believe something that isn't true. But the fact is, it's an invisible enemy.
Yeah. So what we did, and that's why the second part of the title of our book is Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong, because that's the position we were in. Yeah. We thought we'll start from the most basic question we can ask is, well, what really makes you ill? And as we soon found out, everything we thought we knew about disease was wrong, and it's the same for everyone else. So it is quite staggering, and that's why our research took 10 years, because we wanted to make sure we were absolutely right. Because what we were finding is that everything we had been taught by the medical establishment and at school and at university and all the rest of it was complete nonsense and not based on any science. And we found the whole of the medical establishment, its main principles, were not based on any science. Yeah. I mean, we even went to look for the scientific papers which should exist for every virus that they're claiming is the cause of a disease. And those papers don't exist. And they should be in the public domain, because if you can imagine, if you've discovered a new virus and you've gone through all the proper scientific tests and proved that this is the cause of particularly some killer disease, then your name's going to be in lights. You're going to go down in medical history. You're going to get lots of money, and get on the sort of circuit of giving speeches and things.
Aren't there any papers at all? Because I remember Andrew Kaufman saying, and I believe you guys have spoken with Dr. Kaufman, he was saying that he went through the original papers that claimed to illustrate a causal relationship between said particle, SARS-CoV-2, and this specific set of symptoms. But he sort of analysed them, and they claimed to satisfy Koch's postulates. The sort of logical 4 or 5 steps you have to go through to prove causation, and he sort of picked them apart and found that they actually didn't prove anything. Is that what you're referring to when you say there effectively aren't any papers that prove it?
I mean, to start with, there weren't any papers at all. And then, of course, I think the establishment realised that people were latching onto this, people like us who were going, hold on a minute, where are these papers? We're not the only ones. I mean, no. Carrie Mullis, who died last year, and PCR, inventor of the PCR, he looked for them as well. We're not the only ones that have looked for these papers.
Yeah.
And he specifically looked for the scientific papers to prove that there was a virus causing AIDS.
Yes.
And he said, they're not there. The papers are not there.
Yeah.
Now, so what's been happening in more recent times, and Andy Kaufman, he's a friend of ours, he's interviewed us a couple of times, he knew this too, and he looked at one of these more recent papers, and to their utter shame, this particular paper that Andy looked at was actually published in the journal Nature, which is probably the most prestigious scientific paper in the world. And they published this paper in there, which on the face of it, in the abstract, which is sort of the little paragraph or two right at the beginning of the paper, claimed that they'd isolated the virus and it had met Koch's postulates, and they proved that it did cause COVID-19. So, and most people, including doctors, never get past the abstract. They don't read all the methodology. They just look at the abstract and go, oh, there you go, it's been done. But Andy, like us, would look further and go, hold on a minute, we smell a rat here, let's have a proper look at this. And sure enough, and Andy did exactly this. He looked through the methodology and saw that it did nothing of the kind. Mm-hmm. And also in the methodology, which is staggering, the people who'd written the paper admitted in the methodology that they'd not isolated the virus, they'd not completely categorized it, they'd not met Koch's postulates, and they'd not proved that it caused the disease. So within the methodology of the paper was in complete contradiction to what they'd written in the abstract. Now, to me, that's fraud.
That is fraud.
And yet they got away with it. They just left it there. Yeah. And so unless anyone actually took the trouble to look at the methodology, because it's quite technical and very boring, they've been on the wiser. They just look at the abstract and go, well, it's all been done.
Yes.
Because it says so in the title.
Because it says so in the title. And this is, to me, that shows the desperation that the establishment is prepared to go to tell such lies as that, and to trick people into believing that the proper work had been done, and it hasn't.
Yeah, and it's even more staggering, isn't it, when you look back? You've mentioned AIDS and of course SARS-1 and all of these other virus things in the past. And the same is true there. There's actually no substantial proof, and everyone just goes along with the assumption, isn't it? It's quite incredible. The other thing I wanted to mention that sort of, I'm sure you guys have noticed as well, is that the sort of big pharma or the medical cartel, or whatever we want to call them, the establishment, as you just label them, medical establishment, I always found it so odd that they are never concerned to hear about how diet may prevent illness, disease, unwellness. Let's call it illness. They sort of reject and discount the fact that, glyphosate, for example. I mean, why isn't anyone talking about glyphosate? Or why aren't the WHO, the World Health Organization, interested in how glyphosate destroys, your gut lining and all of these other things, the EMFs and all the other toxic issues? are completely ignored by these same people who are now telling us that we need to be really, really scared of this little virus that nobody's ever proven exists. And I found this such a staggering contradiction, or sort of key part of the context. Who's talking? Literally, the World Health Organization, WHO, and our governments have never ever been interested really in all of these really legitimate challenges to our health, particularly the ones that fall under your four main categories. And now all of a sudden they're telling us conveniently this one thing that it is a threat to our health. It's something we must all be scared of. And you can't see it, and it's not proven to exist. And
And the other staggering thing is more and more people in every major country in the world have been writing under the Freedom of Information Act to their governments and to the relevant health bodies to ask for the scientific information to show that they have done all the things I've just said, isolated, categorise it and all the rest of it. And we've got a whole collection of these, and they are available. And every one of them has come back where the government departments have said, we don't have that information, which again is staggering. Yes. When they're asked for it and they admit they haven't got it. And yet they continue with this lie. And I think that just shows how disrespectful they are to the general public. It shows that this whole farce is not based on any science.
No.
And it shows quite obviously to us, and I'm sure to yourself, that there is some other agenda going on here, which is nothing to do with science, and it's nothing to do with a virus, it's nothing to do with disease. There's some other agenda afoot, and we can talk about that if you wish.
Absolutely. Well, I think it was Dr. McCullough that first said it to me, Dr. Joseph McCullough. It mentioned that, of course, health has become politicised. And as you say, or as others have said, when things don't make sense, there's another agenda afoot. If you're assuming something and it all doesn't fit, if you're assuming that these people are interested in protecting health, and it doesn't make sense, then of course there has to be another agenda afoot. And given this politicization of health, there's a big clue there, isn't there? The big clue that there's a political agenda. And of course, if we look a little bit further, we can see, oh yes, there are published agendas that quite clearly advocate for global governance and more control and all these other things that do happen to fit nicely into what we're seeing.
I just wanted to comment back on something that you mentioned as a particular word. You're saying about contradictions. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that we managed to find all over the place within the pronouncements of either the WHO, CDC, NHS, various bodies. We found so many contradictions. They'd say one thing and in one place, and they'd say something completely different in the other place. Yep. And they're the kinds of things that we expose within the book.
Fantastic.
To show that their ideas about health and disease, whatever, they may say one thing in one place and they'll say something else that contradicts it. And so we try and highlight those to show people that these are the people that are supposed to be in charge of your health. And there's an awful lot that they are saying that doesn't make sense, as you've just said. No. But not only that, we also found, and certainly more the case in chronic diseases, that they even admitted that they don't know quite a lot about certain things, including, we don't exactly know the cause, or we don't know the exact cause, or certain amounts of this particular disease is unknown. We're still looking at it. These things are not understood.
And they pretend they don't know the causes of disease, do they? Which is in a nutshell.
They pretend they do in these on the various pronouncements about like you say on the BBC or whatever. But if you actually look behind the scenes, if you start really digging, that's when you find out that they admit in various study papers, we don't quite understand. We're still looking at it, and these are not sort of old papers we're talking about, within the last few years, admissions that, we don't fully understand this, or we don't quite know this, or it's absolutely astounding. And these are the people that are telling us that they know about our health, and, we should hand over our power to them to look after the health.
Hence why we say over the 10 years, we never found any of their pronouncement to be actually based on scientific proof.
Right.
And as we've said, for anyone who expounds a theory, the onus is on them to prove what they say.
Of course. And
So-
I'm now adding in with contradictions because, as a passionate truth seeker myself, I'm very interested in sort of the techniques of knowing what's true and identifying what's false. And of course, whenever you see a contradiction, there's something wrong, because if two people are saying opposite things about the same thing, at least one of them has to be wrong. And so
Exactly.
that there's mischief afoot. If in the same organization you've got contradictions, then it's like a beep, 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 major red flag saying, contradiction alert, because contradictions don't exist in reality. They can't exist in reality. And so we can know for sure whenever we encounter them that we need to dig a little bit deeper and find what's going on.
Which is what we were doing.
Yeah.
We saw contradictions, said, no, okay, well, we can't accept this, and we need to keep looking at,
get to the bottom of it.
get to the bottom of the problem.
I come back to your qualifications. Your qualifications are way better than any medical doctor by virtue of that technique alone.
Yeah.
Well, by virtue of the fact that we kept asking questions, we
Yes.
didn't take anything for granted. And when we
Indeed.
found something, we said, well, okay, if that applies in this particular case, what about that case?
Yeah.
We kept doing the kind of thing that people, asking the kind of questions that we knew people would ask us. Well, what about?
Yeah.
What if?
Detective
How about
work.
that? And we just kept dig.
And that's why we also looked at animal diseases as well, so-called diseases as well, because we thought, well, if germs, viruses, bacteria don't cause disease in humans, it should be true for animals. They shouldn't be able to cause disease, and we found exactly that. Even though, according to the establishment, they were causing diseases in animals, whether it was tuberculosis or mad cow disease. We examined that because that was a big thing in the UK, and we found out no, it was nothing to do with the germ. In the case of mad cow disease, it was purely the ministry's insistence that the cattle were in the dip. They washed down with a particular dip, which we found was organophosphate, which is a neurotoxin. So we investigated that further. Again, I'm cutting a long story short, but we found out why it was such a big thing in the UK was because the strength of the dip in the UK was something like 4 times stronger than any other country. So it was really toxic and was poisoning the poor cows.
Yes.
And of course, it went into their central nervous system and gave the appearance of them going mad because they lost control of their limbs.
Yeah.
And so thousands of cattle were destroyed through a mistake of the government and the ministry.
Yeah.
Because they weren't going to admit that.
No.
And they get sued for multiple millions of pounds for what they'd done.
Yeah.
But that's the truth of it. Again, nothing to do with the germ.
So we've really sort of thrashed to death why, or rather not the reason why we get ill. So maybe we should turn our attention back to the reason why we get ill again. So you've mentioned toxicity and lack of nutrition. Do you? I mean, there are other researchers and medical people out there that talk about inflammation. How can you bring in? And there's, of course, there's chronic and acute inflammation. Chronic being ongoing, acute sort of dealing with some present emergency. How does your 4 categories that cause disease? Do you deal with? Can you tie inflammation into that?
Yes, we talk about inflammation. We discovered, again, it's not quite what we're told it is. It is actually a mechanism produced by the body to protect a particular area. So, for example, if you get a splinter or something, the area becomes inflamed. But that's not because it's a problem, but it's protective to bring extra blood to the area, which carries extra repair materials, so it helps the body heal itself. Now that's, if you like, acute. So when the splinter comes out, the redness goes away and it heals, and and the healthier you are, the quicker that healing will take place. Now that's I assume what you mean by acute inflammation. Now chronic inflammation is where the healing process is taking longer, possibly because of all sorts of other factors that are preventing the body from being effective in healing, and so it can be prolonged, and it can get to the stage where it can start being causing an interference. So it's but it's not the inflammation that is the problem. It's not something it's not a disease process, it's a protective mechanism, but that's because it's trying to help the body heal itself. But again, it's an inversion of, inflammation is a bad thing, you must take anti-inflammatories. No, it's, the same thing that, don't take things to suppress symptoms. But at the same time, you need to be aware that, as you say, the sort of chronic inflammation can be problematic, but that's only if the body isn't being able to be effective in its healing.
Right. Which, of course, is usually the delay in the body healing itself is usually very often caused by the medical establishment themselves, because, as Dawn said, someone gets some inflammation, let's say it's in the knee, and so they want the doctor to give them something to reduce that inflammation, which, of course, then is stopping the body from doing its natural process of healing. So it then becomes a chronic situation because the body's trying to heal it. The drugs the doctor's given you are trying to stop it. And so you've got this tug of war thing, and you end up with a long lasting, plus the additional toxicity of the drugs that he's giving you. So it's, you're in a lose-lose situation once the doctors get involved and start giving you drugs to stop a natural bodily process.
Yeah, crazy. So do you go into in your book, in your 4 categories of what causes illness, for example, nutrition? I must confess I haven't read it. I'm looking forward to getting a copy and reading it because it sounds fantastic. But do you go into, because nutrition itself is quite a broad topic, isn't it? And
yes.
and then of course toxicity. So can you give us an overview of those categories, or how you approach it?
Sure. Yes, we do go into nutrition. Well, we go into all of the categories in depth to explain, but just to give sort of a bit of an overview of nutrition. Again, through our studies, we looked at what's the ideal diet so that people can get the correct level of nutrition. And in short, we recommend as much as possible to have an organic plant-based diet with as much raw food as you can. Both Dawn and I are actually vegans, but again, there are certain dangers in veganism, not because veganism itself is dangerous, but because there's a lot of manufacturers latched onto veganism and started producing processed food, artificial meats and artificial all sorts of things, which may be tasty and may be convenient to vegans, but they don't have the correct level of nutrition, because very rarely do any processed foods have the correct level of nutrition. Only fresh food has the correct level of nutrition and in the right balance. You can't beat Mother Nature for packaging nutrients in the right format for the body to be able to assimilate. So it's not a case of, I can eat anything I like and then take some multivitamin tablets. It doesn't work like that, because almost all of the multivitamin tablets you get are not in an organic format. They're in an inorganic format, right, which the body can't process.
Right, it makes them less bioavailable, does that?
Sorry?
It makes them less bioavailable.
Yes, the body can't use them. But plants, when they're growing, they can take in those minerals and things, and they change them from inorganic to organic, so that then when you eat the plant, the body can assimilate those organic nutrients. Okay. So, and of course, we say organic as well because of the methods used in sort of modern day farming, where a lot of plants are sprayed with God knows what, all sorts of insecticides, pesticides,
glyphosate.
Yeah, glyphosate, artificial fertilizers and things like that, all of which those residues or are taken up into the plant, and you eat them and take them into your body. So even though you're buying vegetables which may look at your local supermarket, which may look nice, nice big red peppers and things like that, but if they're not organic, they may lack in nutrients because they've been grown in some of these artificial fertilizers or nutrient soils which are depleted in those nutrients, so the plants can't take them up. But because they've had artificial feed, they may look good, but they're not able to pass on those correct levels of nutrients to you because they don't have them anymore.
Yeah. And I suppose that there's also a crossover into your other section on toxicity, isn't there? Because food can not only not nourish you, modern food grown in depleted soils, with no magnesium or calcium or anything actually left in the soil to be taken up by the plants. But then that food can also, as well as it not being nutritious, it can actually be toxic in that it's now poisoning your internal environment, which is of course your blood. So there's an overlap there, isn't there, in those two sections?
Absolutely. I mean, we do talk about the toxins in manufactured food products, all the different artificial colorings and flavorings, but also the fact that preservatives are used in foods in order to stop the germs, so to protect them. But I mean, of course, anything that's designed to prevent some kind of germ or contamination by germs means that it's going to be toxic by nature, because by definition it's trying to get rid of the germ. So that's already something that's got to be toxic. Absolutely. So yes, we do expose a kind of manufactured foods, and that's why comes.
Excuse me interjecting again, but that comes full circle to Louis Pasteur, doesn't it? And pasteurization, and the super boiling of milk up to, I don't know what they do, 130 degrees or something for X number of minutes. I can't remember. But not only, misguided, because it's not only destroying the nutritional qualities of the milk, isn't it? All those bacteria which are labelled as harmful but are in fact health supporting are getting killed.
Yeah. Well, they even do the same with orange juice. If you look at your carton of what you think 100% fresh orange juice, which you can get, and it'll say pasteurized. So they've even done it to something like orange juice. So why? They take most of the goodness out of it by boiling it, basically, and giving it back to you.
So that's why we say fresh foods as much as possible. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, with the issue of toxicity, do you talk about, because obviously toxicity, it does cross over with food and nourishment, but then there's the home, isn't there? And the sort of your toxic hairspray, your toxic perfumes, your toxic sofa and carpet and paint. It goes on and on, doesn't it? For the unwary modern dweller, there's toxicity everywhere.
Yes, and we found clothes as well, which was quite shocking to us again.
Bit of a surprise,
So yes, but we also, as well as exposing the problems, we do try and help people find, sort of guide them towards, if you like, sort of non-toxic alternatives. And certainly as far as, home cleaning products and personal care products, that there is definitely a lot more available for people where they can source and use far less toxic. There are some chemicals within the processes, but they're far better, far easier.
It's almost impossible in this day and age to eliminate exposure to all toxins because it's everywhere. But you can minimize it because the body's not a helpless mechanism. It can process things and clear them out again, provided it's got the correct nutrition. It needs that nutrition to drive the engine, if you like. So long as you can limit them and the body can cope with them, then that's you can get away with it. But it does get more and more difficult. But a sure sign, if your body for some reason is not able to get rid of the toxins, is when it manifests as so-called cold or flu, should I say, because they're not diseases, as we can go into. They're, as I think Dawn mentioned earlier, they're detox mechanisms.
Right, yeah, so please elaborate. Elaborate on that if you'd like to,
So what the body's doing is, if it's not able to clear itself out of the toxic intake that it's been assaulted with, shall we say, you get a more of a crisis. And that manifests when the body then, instead of it being able to get it out through the urine and excrement, sweat, that sort of thing, it will pull in the mucous membranes to, again, take it out of the lungs if the toxins are in there, and you'll get sort of coughs and sneezes and runny noses, all the symptoms that you get with colds, what would normally class as colds. Now they say you've got COVID, of course, because it's the same symptoms. Or if it's a heavier attack of toxins that it's trying to get rid of, those same symptoms are just amplified, and then it's called influenza. But it's the same thing. It's a natural process of the body trying to get rid of a toxic overload. And the best thing to do in those instances is to go to bed and don't eat, don't take anything in, rest, just take liquid water, clean water. We do talk about the importance of clean water because you can't get it out of your tap.
Mm-hmm.
You need reverse osmosis system or a distiller, which are readily available. You can buy them. So you've got clean water, and just rest for a couple of days and your body will heal much quicker and you'll be okay. If you start taking loads of drugs, it will just take longer because it's now having to cope with the drugs as well as the overload that it had already got. But those are natural symptoms. They're natural detox. And if you've got, and Dawn and I know this for ourselves, if you've kept your body healthy, you'll never have another cold symptom or flu symptom ever again. So, because most people say, I usually get 1 or 2 colds every year. Well, you wouldn't if you were doing all the right things to your body. You wouldn't have any.
Unless you are exposed to something, either something in the environment where, a local, if you live near a field or whatever, and suddenly they start spraying and you're exposed to it and you're out in your garden. And so you might have the symptoms. So if people do have symptoms, it's not to feel that they've, made a mistake. They've not looked after themselves.
It just means there's more detoxing to be done, I guess.
It's just, yes. But also that detox is not a single kind of one-off overnight thing. It's a process, but it happens far fewer times, so it becomes less and less and less. The symptoms are far less severe, and you start noticing that you feel better. Your skin feels clearer, and these things start improving. But one of the problems, of course, you may see, as I say, some kind of spraying, but there is an awful lot of environmental toxins, and including EMFs as well, that you might not be aware of. And so sometimes people are not feeling very well and have no real understanding of what could be the cause. Now, it could be something, an environmental toxin they've not been aware of, could be spraying something up in the sky or whatever, or it could be something around them with some kind of EMF. Unfortunately, there are some that we can't do anything about, some exposures we can't do anything about. But as David was saying before, if we try and do as much as possible about the ones we can do something about, so everything you put in and on your body, if you try and keep those to be as toxin free as possible, then you can be healthier and you can deal with the other ones that come along occasionally, and it can be less, the effect can be less severe.
And that also sort of speaks into the need for proactive detoxification, doesn't it? I mean, things like saunas and exercise and sweating, these sort of things, and then there are other means for detoxing, that people can look into. And I guess it's all health supporting, isn't it? If it helps minimize your toxic load. But maybe we can move into EMFs, because you touched on them there, Dawn. How much of a component do you think these are to ill health? Obviously, we're all aware that EMFs are a ubiquitous sort of fact of life. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, mobile phone use, it's all over the place. It's very difficult to minimize that. What do you have to say about EMFs in general and their impact on health?
Sure. Yeah, the sources of EMFs are sort of impossible to eliminate unless you because if you use electricity in the house, even the cables in the walls of your house, are emitting electromagnetic fields. All electrical appliances emit electromagnetic fields. It's a natural process of electricity. It's unfortunate that the frequencies that both the UK, all of Europe, and the United States use, we use 50 hertz, that's 50 cycles a second, and 60 cycles a second in America. It's unfortunate that those frequencies are probably some of the most damaging frequencies to the human body. They could have chosen different frequencies. You can have different frequencies that electricity works at, which would have been less damaging. But whether that's deliberate or accidental, who can say? But it's just a fact of life. But then we've got all these other frequencies, which, as you rightly say, are from mobile phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell towers, mobile phone towers, shall I say, in the UK, all emitting all sorts of different frequencies. And of course, we've got this advent of 5G coming, which people are worried about because it's even higher frequency, higher energy. Now, the only things we can recommend is to minimize your exposure. And we always say to people, get rid of the things in your house that are the biggest emissions. Now, as an electrical engineer, I've got various pieces of test equipment, one of which is I can measure frequencies being emitted by various pieces of apparatus. And I'm going back a few years now, but I was quite shocked to find at the time I had the cordless phones in my house that sort of sit in the little cradle, and you can walk around, very convenient. But I was horrified to see the amount of power and high frequencies that were emitted by the base stations of those mobile phones. It was dreadful, well into the dangerous range, according to the meter that I had. So they were the first things to go. Now, unfortunately, things like, we all need, we're using it now, we all need Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and computers to be able to do the things we do. So the only thing you can do is minimize your exposure. And I would advise people never have electronic or electrical equipment in your bedroom, for instance. A lot of people take the phones into the bedroom and leave them charging overnight. Don't do it. Leave it in another room, well away from you, as far away as possible. Anything like that you can keep out of your bedroom so that at least you can sleep properly, because sleep is a very important thing. We can talk a little bit about that. But as regards being able to shield yourself completely from EMFs is practically impossible. Yeah. You could do it if you sort of lived in a Faraday cage, but as well as keeping out all the external frequencies, obviously you wouldn't be able to use any of your phones or anything like that from inside the cage because it couldn't transmit through it. Yeah. And you also run the risk of isolating yourself from the Earth's natural frequencies, the Schumann frequencies, which is about 8 hertz, which is essential for the normal mechanism and circadian rhythms of the body. So you don't want to shield yourself from those. So it's a very difficult thing to do. So the only thing you can do is minimize the equipment and your exposure to it.
Wired systems in homes is probably very good. We don't have any Wi-Fi here. It's all wired and yes. It's amazing. You've got better security, better speed, and often better everything if you wire it, and better health as well. So I always try and advocate people to wire systems. Obviously, mobile phone use is something that needs to be kept in its box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
so
right.
do you? Is it the Martin Powell in the States, the researcher that was brought to my notice by Dr. McCullough, and his meta-analyses of a lot of research? He was talking about the effects of a lot of these pulsed microwave frequencies is sort of opening the voltage gated calcium channels in cells and causing this sort of cascade of it causes a cascade of events which ultimately result in free radicals being produced inside the cell. They're sort of being poisoned from the inside of our cell, even inside our mitochondria. Yes. Is that the sort of school of thought that you subscribe to, or are there other factors that I'm not aware of in really why these EMFs are dangerous? Because a lot of people think, well, why is it dangerous?
We do refer to his work in our book as well.
But if
some of the studies, but yes. Well.
If people realise that, people often think of the body as a chemical system. Certainly the pharmaceutical companies treat it as a chemical system, and that everything can be corrected by adding a different chemical to the body in the shape of one of their petrochemical drugs, because all their drugs are derived from petrochemicals, as you probably know. But the body's just as much a sophisticated electrical system as well, on which the Chinese acupuncture system is based on. They knew several thousand years ago that there was this very subtle electrical system in the body that was vital for how the body worked, heart, brain, and their acupuncture systems were, when there was problems, they knew what to do, where they could sort of mediate and do some work on that electrical system to try and free up the blockages. But just as a prime example, if people are not quite sure just how this works, if you imagine I often use the example, if you imagine you've got your little portable radio and someone nearby sets off an electric drill, particularly an unsuppressed electric drill, you'll hear all sorts of crackling and squealing and noise on your radio, which is not the music you were probably originally listening to. Well, there you're experiencing electrical interference from the drill through the air to your radio.
Mm-hmm.
But if you imagine the human body similar, and so you've got now very subtle, and it is very subtle, tiny little voltages and currents that flow through the body. And now you've got these very powerful electrical emissions all around you. It's hardly surprising that they're going to have some effect on the electrical system of the body. And it's been shown that with the nerves, for instance, the myelin sheaths that cover the nerves, which have been shown to be semiconductors in themselves,
Mm-hmm.
can be destroyed or holes knocked into them by EMFs. And then that can cause things like multiple sclerosis. I mean, those myelin sheaths can be damaged by chemicals as well, but they, as I say, they can also be damaged by EMFs. So, and that's quite a serious ailment, a serious illness, which can be very detrimental, even to the point of killing people. The electron chain, that, as it's called, which operates in the body, which sort of takes oxygen and things like that, can be affected because electrons are electrical by nature. So any electrical interference to that electron chain by EMFs can disrupt the body's natural workings and can bring about things like obesity and diabetes. Those have been shown to be some of the causes that can be attributed to EMFs. So, and those are the more obvious and serious ones. But just the normal functioning of the body, even as some people have started referring to brain fog, which sort of memory doesn't seem to serve you quite so well, or well,
and even tinnitus, this sort of like a high-pitched kind of sound that more and more people are being able to hear.
Yeah.
So that's another effect, but and there are certainly some people who are so affected that they cannot be near any kind of electrical equipment at all. I mean, they're so super electrosensitive. It really, so it can be quite damaging. But there again, various effects. But as David said, the certain effects can be caused by chemicals or EMFs, but they can work synergistically as well. So the chances of being affected by only one, either a toxin or an EMF, are pretty rare. It's almost certainly going to be combinations of the two,
Sure.
and that they can work synergistically. And even though you think electrical interferences can't affect the chemical system, I mean that's not the case. The electrical toxins, if you like, can affect the chemical system, and chemical toxins can affect the electrical system. So they're not separate. And they can certainly do so at a cellular level.
A little example that again we talk about, because we talk about dentistry in the book, and as an electrical engineer, there was a particular fascinating thing that I came across with regards to amalgam fillings. Now, people may think amalgam fillings, oh yeah, I've heard about mercury content and that's all very toxic. But there's a lot more interesting to it, fact to it. Because in your amalgam filling, there's several metals in there, zinc and mercury, to name but two. Now, from an electrical point of view, anytime you get two dissimilar metals together in the presence of an electrolyte, which in this case in your mouth would be your saliva, you have a battery. So in each of your amalgam fillings, you've now got a little battery giving out an electrical charge, and these can be measured now, and it's in your mouth, i.e. in your head, and
so next to your brain.
And there is a lot of neurological problems that can be brought down to literally the amalgam fillings in your mouth. Now, there's a very good case study, which I think we talk about in the book, from some research done by a dentist, where he had a young girl come to his surgery for work on her fillings. And a parent had said that the girl was suffering from leukemia, which seems to be more common in children. So she got childhood leukemia. And the dentist, I won't go into a long story, but he asked the parent if he could do an experiment and take all of the girl's fillings out. And the parent let him do that. And within a day or two, her leukemia had disappeared.
Wow.
And the dentist said, I attribute that directly to her fillings. Well, people wouldn't believe him. They said, oh, it's purely coincidental. It can't possibly be true. How can dental fillings be causing her leukemia? And he said, well, I'll prove it. I'll put the fillings back, which is what he did. And sure enough, her leukemia came back. Yes. So I'm happy to say he did take them back out again at the end. So, but that's a very good example. And this is by a dentist who'd been in the profession for many years and saw that in his own surgery.
Yeah. Another good point there is to avoid implants as well. These, false teeth implanted in your jaw. That's another just stick of metal to make a battery in your mouth.
Yeah. So I know these might sound like horror stories, but we really try to make people aware of things they may not be aware of so that they can make informed decisions. Absolutely. As you just said, you may think, well, I'll do something else. Yeah.
Let's move it on to, just to wrap up because I'm aware of time, let's move on to the sort of your fourth category, which, correct me if I'm wrong, long-term stress.
Emotional stress, yes.
Yeah. Can you expand on that? Sure. As you do in the book, and talk about how that is a component that makes us ill.
Okay. Yes, I mean, the main component, we'll talk about it because it's obviously an involved subject, but when the body's under stress, it produces certain reactions, chemical reactions, and one of which is, as we talked about, free radicals. There's an increase in free radicals. Okay. Now, under normal circumstances, again with the correct nutrition, your body will handle that. But if this stress is prolonged, because normally stress it's a bit like the flight or fight syndrome, so it's a short burst, job's over, your body then goes back to its normal homeostasis. Mm-hmm. But if you've got prolonged emotional stress, it's in that stress state, almost the fight state, all the time. So it now pushes it out of homeostasis, and the body's releasing high levels and continuous levels of free radicals, which, as I pointed out, can be damaging at cellular level and at organ level. So if you've got this prolonged, it's going to start damaging doing serious damage to the human body. And this is without taking on the mental attitudes of depression. We've all heard of how the suicide rates, since people have been in this imprisonment situation that we're in, the high rate of suicides that has increased both in the UK and in America. I mean, when we were talking to Dr. Andy Kaufman not so long ago, he said to us that the suicide rate in America has gone up by about 30%. 30%. I mean, that's dreadful. But is that talked about on the news? No, I doubt it very much. And that's a direct result of this stressful state that the governments have put onto people without any scientific reason for doing so. So they're really, the government's actions in all the countries is responsible for more deaths and misery than any fictitious disease, because there is one. So no one's dying of COVID. Well, they certainly are dying of these stressful situations. Yeah. And of course, the human interaction between people becomes more distressful, where people have been told they've got to stay 6 feet apart and wear masks, and not hug anyone. Human beings are social animals. And if you deny them those things, you're going to have all sorts of detrimental things happening in the body, because that's not how we're supposed to be. So the whole stress thing just exacerbates, and as well as I say, causing mental disorders, it causes actual physical disorders through the excessive release of free radicals.
Right. Are there also sort of hormonal problems? Because, I mean, people have probably heard of things like cortisol or and adrenaline, these sort of things that are, I know when my lads are playing their computer games, it's like they're right on the edge of their seat, in some sort of combat scenario, and you think that must have an enormous effect on the chemical composition going around in your blood. So is that a component to this ongoing stressful way of life?
Well,
Yes.
there
Yes.
are, yes. I mean, the sort of release of hormones are fairly normal, and obviously, when in certain situations they become raised, and obviously you don't want to have the levels too raised because that can certainly cause an imbalance. Um,
But if it's
but
prolonged,
yes, I mean, if it's prolonged,
that's the
that can
problem.
start doing the damage. But but there are hormones. Are different from the free radicals, but I mean, yes, they are certainly different parts of the kind of stress reactions that can happen within the body, and it is about leading, if you like, kind of keeping things at a balanced level. So there's nothing wrong with there's yes, I mean, one of the people, the work. Sorry, his name escapes me for the second, but he I think he distinguishes it quite well by saying stress is normal, but it's only when it becomes distress that it can be quite harmful. So if you like, sort of, getting excited and having something that's really good and pleasurable and being very happy and exhilarated, that's sort of putting your body under stress, and you'll get a hormone reaction to that. But that, if you like, is good stress. That's okay, but it's not going to be prolonged necessarily. But when it becomes distress and prolonged, and then that's when the damaging effects. But the effects of the mind as well, again, because we talk about a little bit about the power of belief, that can be shown by the placebo effect, where people can be given sugar pills, placebos, and they can have very, very positive health reactions or health effects from that. There is also the converse, the nocebo effect, which is where people can believe something really bad is going to happen. So, for example, that could be playing out at the moment, where people think just because they have a cough and sneeze that suddenly they've got this deadly disease, and that could actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, I mean, there's something, it's a well-known phenomenon of people. It's called, dying from the diagnosis, where they're told they have a disease. So they actually believe it's part of them, and they are then told, well, you've probably got 3 months, and a number of people do actually literally die pretty much on to the 3 months. It's known. There are others who say, no, I don't accept that, and completely reject it, and they may make changes in their life. They may implement all kind of health regime. They may decide to change it, but they don't accept that particular prognosis, and they can go on to live for years, have a perfectly normal, and in fact they can become healthier because suddenly they're starting to make changes, and they
so mindset can have a profound effect, can't it?
Exactly.
I mean, and this is something that even doctors know. As I say, don't use the expression "dying of the diagnosis," and that's an expression used in the medical profession. Yeah. They're well aware of it, and yet they do it and are limiting people's life expectancy by making this pronouncement on them. And there's lots of experiments that have been done to see how that works, and it can be traced back into sort of native societies, to shamans and so-called witch doctors and that.
Voodoo hex.
The voodoo hex, where people believe in that, and the witch doctor can basically point his bone at someone and pronounce they'll die in a few days, and it's been seen that person will die in a few days. So the power of belief is an extremely powerful thing. And the placebo-nocebo in modern medicine is something that doctors use. Yeah. I mean, we've seen cases of even placebo surgery, would you believe, on knee complaints. But again, we do talk about some of these things, but too much to go into now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe by way of sort of wrapping this whole thing up. You obviously, we're looking at what makes us ill, and the goal, of course, is to not get ill. So I'm maybe you can throw in a few words as to. I mean, I guess your book, as it explores these means of becoming ill, these 4 causes of illness, are you sort of at the same time as identifying the causes, offering solutions? You kind of hinted to the fact that you do. Is that something that you wrap up with, or is that an ongoing process through the book?
Well, it is to a point an ongoing process, but what we try to do is we sort of put it together like a detective story, because we realise, when we have a title like "Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong," people are going to go, "What? That can't be true." So we realised we'd got to set it out like a detective story, build the evidence, so that people, by the time they get to the end of the book, they can see why we've said that and why we're saying what the solutions are. And they can take them on board then. Because if we gave them right at the beginning, they'd go, "Oh, I don't believe that."
So the solutions are in people's own hands, because we show that it's people's own health. They can take responsibility for their own health, and so they can make the changes. But it is up to people to make informed decisions to then implement the changes. So we like to think that we've given people a large amount of information that they can then make the informed decisions for their own health.
It's very empowering, isn't it? Because you can take control over what you put in your mouth. You can take control over your exposure to EMFs to some large degree, I'd say. You can, detoxify your home and your environment, and it's a lifestyle choice, really. I mean, I've become convinced over the last few years that health really is a lifestyle choice, and if we can knock our lifestyle choices into line with our proclaimed goal of longevity and optimal health, then there's an awful lot we can do, isn't there? And it sounds like your book is a huge contribution towards that goal. So maybe could you say, any other closing comments, please throw in, but maybe you could just remind us of where we could get the book and your website and a few other contact details.
I just happen to have a copy to hand.
Great.
I don't know if you can see that, but that's the book.
The lights are reflecting on it a little bit. Maybe you can maybe you could just tilt it backwards and forwards. Just about read that. Why everything you thought you knew about disease is wrong. I like the thinking man as well. That's very
that's and as you can see, it's quite a tome. It's a big book, so don't drop it on your foot. But you can get a Kindle version. One is it's cheaper, and of course you can get it very quick. I think in the UK it's about less than £10. Less than £10. Yeah. It's obviously from Amazon. You can buy it from Amazon anywhere worldwide, and most online bookstores. So you can. That's the places to get them from, really.
Right. And do you have a website?
Sorry?
Do you have a website, yes.
Oh, yeah.
whatreallymakesyouill.com.
Yeah, so nice and easy, whatreallymakesyouill.com. Lots of information on there. We put articles and that up there. Interviews like this one will be up there so people can watch and listen. And people can, we have a thing that people can review our work and make comments.
Contact us.
So long as they're not rude. And contact us if they wish. But I do ask people to read the book first before you start asking us questions, because we don't want to recite the book.
No, a lot of the answers are in there, absolutely.
Yes, they're all there. So,
well, look, thank you so much to you both for sharing, the essence of your book, and I'll put some links below the video and on the podcast show notes, so when people can link to your website and indeed pick up a copy of your book. But thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your perspective. It's been wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you got some value from this. I do urge you to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more there on health issues and indeed thinking issues, how to find truth, various techniques and so forth. So please visit that, and hope you get something from that. And also do join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be